The document landed in Washington this week, and the Americans who wrote the rules did not expect to read this. NATO's most senior military body has just concluded, formally, in writing, that Canada must take a leading role in the future of the Western Alliance. Not a supporting role, not a contributing role, a leading role. This is the institution that coordinates the defense of 32 nations, the body that advises every NATO head of state on how the alliance fights, how it deters, and how it survives. And it has looked at the restructured NATO that Washington is forcing into existence and pointed at Canada as one of the countries that must now carry the weight America is setting down. Washington wanted Europe to step up. It wanted Germany to spend more. It wanted France to take more responsibility. It wanted the eastern flank nations to harden their own borders. What it did not calculate, what the architects of American retrenchment did not fully model, was that Canada was already moving. Quietly, systematically, and with a clarity of strategic purpose that most Western capitals are only now beginning to recognize. My name is Robert Hale. This is Canada Stands. And what has just happened inside the NATO command structure is the most important development for Canadian foreign policy in a generation. Let's start with what triggered this moment, because it did not come from nowhere. It came from a written statement submitted to the United States Senate Armed Services Committee by General Christopher Grinkovich, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the highest military commander in the entire NATO structure. Grinkovich is not a commentator. He is not a politician. He is the operational brain of the Western Alliance, the man responsible for coordinating the defense of Europe from the Arctic down to the Black Sea. When he submits a written statement to the United States Senate, every defense ministry on the planet reads it the same morning it is published. What Grinkovich wrote was not diplomatic language. It was not hedged. He said there has been an unhealthy codependence in the NATO force model on U.S. forces. He named President Trump and Secretary Hegseth directly as the authors of the policy that is ending that codependence. And then he said something with consequences that are still reverberating through every NATO capital this week. He said, European allies and Canada must boost their air and naval forces. Not eventually, not as a long-term planning goal. Now, because the American capability that has been quietly backstopping NATO's collective defense for 75 years is being restructured away from European and Arctic theaters. That is not an opinion. That is the Supreme Allied Commander telling the United States Senate under oath that the force model is changing, and the Allies had better be ready. Now here is where Canada enters this story in a way that almost no international outlet has properly reported. Because Grinkovich's statement did not land in a vacuum in Ottawa. It landed on top of a series of decisions, agreements, and institutional moves that the Canadian government has been making for months. Moves that look, in retrospect, like preparation for exactly the NATO Grinkovich is now describing. The question every serious analyst is now asking is whether Ottawa saw this coming before Washington made it official. And when you look at the timeline, the answer is uncomfortable for a lot of people in a lot of capitals. Go back to the Arctic Security Pact. Canada signed it in Helsingborg alongside 6 allied nations. The agreement commits Canada to a stronger military presence across the high north, expanded surveillance operations, and joint naval and air patrols in the same Arctic corridors, where Russian submarines and Chinese reconnaissance assets have been steadily increasing their activity. Grinkovich specifically identified the high north as a region requiring greater Allied air and naval strength. Canada had already signed an agreement to provide exactly that before his statement was ever submitted to the Senate. That is not coincidence. That is strategic alignment. Then look at the Global Eye decision. Canada selected the Saab Global Eye Airborne Early Warning and Control Aircraft, a platform with a radar range of 650 kilometers capable of simultaneously tracking hundreds of aerial and maritime contacts across vast stretches of open ocean and Arctic airspace. This aircraft does one thing above everything else. It gives Canada sovereign intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability that does not depend on American systems. That matters enormously in the context of what Grinkovich described. Because if American ESAR assets are being redirected away from the Arctic and European theaters, as his statement implies, then any NATO ally that is still dependent on American eyes in the sky is suddenly blind. Canada looked at that risk and bought its own eyes. That decision is now the template every Arctic NATO ally is studying. Consider also what Canada did on drone manufacturing. A Ukrainian drone factory opened in Hamilton, Ontario, producing reconnaissance drones for active combat missions in a live war. This is not a pilot program. This is not a defense industry announcement designed for a press release. This is Canada integrating itself into the real wartime industrial supply chain of the most significant European conflict since 1945. Every drone that comes out of that factory is a data point in Canada's argument that it is a serious defense industrial partner, not a country that shows up to alliance meetings and writes checks. When Grinkovich talks about allied nations building real capability, Canada can point to Hamilton and say the production line is already running. And then there is the NATO Defense Bank. 19 allied nations voted unanimously to place the headquarters of the alliance's new defense financing institution in Canada. Unanimously. This is the institution that will coordinate and fund the massive military expansion that Grinkovich's statement is now making, not just advisable, but urgent. The country that hosts that institution, the country whose legal framework governs its operations, the country whose financial relationships and regulatory environment shape how it deploys capital, that country has structural influence over how the entire alliance rebuilds its military strength. Canada did not lobby quietly for a symbolic role in that institution. It won the vote. All 19 nations agreed. That kind of unanimous institutional endorsement does not happen without a serious, sustained diplomatic effort and a track record that made Canada the obvious choice. Now place all of that against the nomination of General Jenny Carignan to become chair of the NATO Military Committee. This is the alliance's most senior military advisory position. The chair coordinates between the national military representatives of all 32 member states and advises the North Atlantic Council, the political decision-making body of NATO, on military matters. If Carignan is confirmed in the September vote, a Canadian will be sitting at the head of the table coordinating the very force restructuring that Grinkovich has now described in his Senate statement. A Canadian voice will be shaping how the alliance transitions away from American military primacy toward the more distributed, multipolar defense structure that Washington itself is now demanding. This is the detail that changes the entire frame of how you understand what Grinkovich said. Because his statement was addressed to Washington, it was a briefing for American senators about the consequences of American policy. But its operational implications land hardest inside the NATO military structure itself. And if Canada holds the chair of that structure when the restructuring begins in earnest, then Canada is not just a participant in the new NATO. Canada is one of its architects. That is what Washington did not fully calculate. And that is why the response from certain quarters of the American foreign policy establishment to Canada's recent moves has shifted from dismissiveness to something closer to attention. But here is what no one is talking about yet. The Arctic gap that Grinkovich identified is not just a military problem, it is a timeline problem. And the clock is moving faster than most Canadians realize. Because while Canada has been making the right moves, there is one piece of the Arctic defense picture that remains dangerously incomplete. And if it is not addressed in the next 18 months, everything else Canada has built could be rendered far less effective than anyone in Ottawa is currently admitting. What is that gap? And why is 18 months the number that keeps appearing in classified NATO planning documents? That is where Section 2 begins. Let's talk about that gap. Because understanding it requires understanding something most Canadians have never been told directly about how Arctic defense actually works. Surveillance is only half the equation. You can have the best eyes in the sky on the planet, the most sophisticated airborne radar platforms, the most comprehensive satellite coverage of the Northwest Passage and the high Arctic archipelago. But if you cannot get a weapons system, a ship, or an interceptor aircraft to the location you are watching in time to matter, your surveillance capability is not a defense. It is a very expensive front-row seat to your own vulnerability. And that is precisely the gap that sits at the center of Canada's Arctic defense posture right now. Canada can increasingly see what is happening in the high north. What it cannot yet do is respond to what it sees fast enough to deter a serious adversary who knows that gap exists. This is not a theoretical concern. Russian military doctrine has been explicitly built around speed in the Arctic for the better part of a decade. Russia's Northern Fleet, headquartered in Severomorsk and elevated to the status of a full military district in 2021, operates nuclear and conventionally armed submarines across the same Arctic waters that border Canadian territory. Russian hypersonic missile systems, including the Kinzhal and the Zircon, are specifically designed to compress the decision and response window available to NATO commanders. The entire strategic logic of Russia's Arctic posture is to move faster than the alliance can react. And for that strategy to work, Russia needs the alliance to have exactly the kind of gap Canada currently has: strong surveillance, slow response. China compounds this problem in ways that are less visible, but no less serious. Chinese research vessels have been conducting operations in Arctic waters under the cover of scientific missions. Chinese military strategists have written openly about the Arctic as a corridor of strategic interest, and Beijing's relationship with Moscow in the current geopolitical environment means that Chinese surveillance and intelligence activities in the high north feed into a shared picture that both powers can use. Canada's surveillance improvements address part of this problem. They do not address what happens when that surveillance detects something and the response infrastructure is not there to act on it. Now here is where the 18-month figure becomes critical. NATO's defense planning cycle is currently operating on an accelerated timeline driven directly by the force restructuring Grinkovich described in his Senate statement. What that means in practical terms is that the alliance's force structure review, the formal assessment of which allies are providing which capabilities and where the gaps are, is going to produce its next major findings within that window. When it does, the allies that have already closed their capability gaps will be assigned greater responsibility and greater influence within the alliance command structure. The allies that have not will be assigned dependency status. Dependency status inside a restructured NATO that is actively moving away from the American model of carrying dependent allies is not a position Canada can afford to occupy. The Canadian government understands this. The moves Canada has made over the past year make no sense unless Ottawa has been reading the same planning documents and arriving at the same conclusions. But understanding the problem and solving it within a compressed timeline are two different things. And the specific capability Canada needs to close the Arctic response gap is the one that takes the longest to build, costs the most to sustain, and requires the deepest industrial commitment of anything in the defense portfolio: submarines. Canada's submarine program is at an inflection point that deserves far more public attention than it is currently receiving. The Victoria-class submarines that form the backbone of Canada's undersea capability are aging platforms. They were originally built for the Royal Navy in the 1982nd, transferred to Canada in the late 1990s, and have spent much of their service lives in various states of maintenance and refurbishment. They are not Arctic-optimized platforms. Operating under Arctic ice, which is the operational environment that actually matters for the threat scenario Grinkovich described, requires a fundamentally different kind of submarine. It requires a boat with a reinforced sail capable of breaking through ice to surface, with sonar systems tuned for the acoustic environment under Arctic ice packs, with the range and endurance to operate in waters where no support infrastructure exists. Canada does not currently have that capability, and neither the budget nor the industrial base to build it has been formally committed at the scale the threat environment now demands. This is the 18-month problem, because the procurement decisions that need to be made right now, the contracts that need to be signed, the industrial partnerships that need to be established, the shipyard capacity that needs to be reserved, if those decisions slip past the next NATO force structure review, Canada will enter that review with a visible documented gap in exactly the capability the Supreme Allied Commander just told the Senate is most urgently needed: air and naval forces. Canada is moving on air. The global eye is evidence of that. Canada's naval response to the Arctic Gap is still a work in progress at precisely the moment the alliance needs it to be finished. But here is what makes this moment different from every previous Canadian defense debate about submarines and Arctic capability. The financial architecture to support this investment now exists in a way it has never existed before, because Canada hosts the NATO Defense Bank. The institution that 19 allied nations unanimously agreed should be headquartered in Canada is specifically designed to finance the kind of large-scale, long-timeline defense industrial investments that no single national budget can comfortably absorb. A submarine program for Arctic operations is exactly the category of investment that institution was created to support. Canada does not need to fund this capability entirely from its own federal budget. It needs to use the institutional leverage it has already won to bring allied financing, allied industrial partnerships, and allied strategic interest into a program that serves not just Canadian defense, but collective Arctic security. That framing changes the political calculus entirely. Because a Canadian Arctic submarine program framed as a national expenditure is a hard sell in any budget environment. a Canadian Arctic submarine program framed as the host nation of the NATO Defense Bank, anchoring the alliance's collective undersea deterrence in the high north, is something fundamentally different. It is a strategic investment that pays dividends in alliance standing, in industrial capacity, in sovereign capability, and in the kind of irreplaceable institutional role that no ally can easily replicate or replace. And this is where the full picture of what Grinkovich's statement means for Canada comes into focus. Because he did not just describe a problem, he described an opportunity. An opportunity that is time-limited, that is currently available to Canada in a way it has never been before, and that will close once the alliance's force structure settles into its new configuration. The countries that fill the gaps America is leaving will define the next 50 years of the Western Alliance. The countries that hesitate will spend those 50 years as junior partners in a structure built by others. Canada is not hesitating. The nomination for the NATO Military Committee Chair, the Arctic Security Pact, the Global Eye, the drone factory in Hamilton, the NATO Defense Bank. These are not isolated decisions. They are a coordinated strategic architecture built for exactly the NATO that Grinkovich described this week. And the Allies are noticing. The European defense ministries that once looked at Canada as a friendly but peripheral partner are now looking at Ottawa with a different kind of attention. The kind of attention you give to a country that keeps showing up with the right answer before the question has been formally asked. Washington wanted Europe to fill the gap. It got Europe, and it got Canada. And Canada arrived with institutions, with signatures, with hardware decisions, and with a general nominated to chair the body that will coordinate everything that comes next. That is not the Canada the architects of American retrenchment were modeling. That is a Canada that has been thinking 3 moves ahead. And the Supreme Allied Commander just confirmed in writing, before the United States Senate, that Canada's moves were the right ones. The Western Alliance is reorganizing. The map of influence inside NATO is being redrawn right now. And Canada is holding a pen. Subscribe to Canada Stands. Turn on notifications. Share this with someone who still thinks Canada punches below its weight, because the weight class just changed, and Canada came prepared.